just about a quick way of recap. In Acts chapter 24, this would be Paul's third time that he stands trial. I guess second time if we're talking about formal trials that he would stand before. Okay? The very first time was Paul before the Jerusalem council. And if you go back, you can find that in Acts chapter 23. In the beginning verses there in Acts chapter 23. So after Paul was arrested in the temple, he was taken back to the barracks. And from there, the Roman guard would set him before the Jerusalem council just to try to figure out why he was arrested. And again, you got to keep that in the back of your mind. The Romans who have Paul arrested, they don't know why he's arrested. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about, is that they've got this guy who's in custody with them, and they have no clue as to why he's in custody, as to why he's arrested. And so they're trying to get to the bottom of it. So in Acts chapter 23, the beginning verses, they bring him before the Jerusalem council, and they basically say, hey, y'all work this out, y'all get this figured out, and the Romans stood guard around him. Well, like everything else throughout that you can see throughout the New Testament scriptures, is that an argument broke out between the Jews. Well, the Romans rushed in, grabbed Paul, pulled him out of there, and then there was a conspiracy to kill him. It was Paul's nephew who found that out. You can begin reading there in verse 12 and skim through that. Paul was taken because of this conspiracy to kill Paul. Paul was moved to Caesarea. Well, when he came to Caesarea there, beginning in verse 23 and following down to the end of the chapter, he was taken to Herod's palace. And when he was brought to Herod's palace, there he was going to appear before the governor himself. Because they're still trying, again, keep this in the back of your mind, they're still trying to figure out why Paul was arrested. All the Romans know is that there's a big commotion down by the temple. The Roman guard came rolling down there, and there's Paul in the middle of it, and the Jews, mainly the Jews from Asia, but the Jews from the temple there, were beating Paul mercilessly, and that's all the Romans know. They run in, they grab him, they pull him out, and they're trying to figure out why Paul was in the middle of this. And so Paul is arrested. He's appeared before the Jerusalem council. He's been moved to Caesarea because of a death threat. And now he has appeared before Felix, the governor. And we talked a little bit about that last week, and how you can look there in verse 1 of chapter 24. It says, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders. That'd be part of that Sanhedrin. Okay? Keep this in the back of your mind. These are the same people, except for the high priest Ananias, who would put Jesus to death. By the way, Ananias is Caiaphas' son-in-law. Caiaphas was the high priest who put Jesus Christ to death. So there in verse 1 you can see the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, coming down. And notice that they have a lawyer with them. In verse 1 of Acts 24 it says a certain attorney named Tertullus. They brought charges to the governor against Paul. Okay? Now, Tertullus would speak first. Let him begin the court setting. And again, you got to get this court setting in your mind. It's like a traditional court. Felix is sitting as judge. He's the one guy who's sitting up and listening to the proceeding of the case that's before him. You've got Tertullus and the Jews on this side, and you've got the Apostle Paul on this side. Well, Tertullus, their attorney, makes their case first. And he tells them, and you can kind of skim through some of those verses there, he tells them that they hadn't done anything wrong. They were basically just trying to carry out their own law. You can see there in verse 6. At the end of verse 6, he says, we wanted to judge him according to our own law. Well, the truth is that they were beating him mercilessly. And he was just lying about that part. Now, after the Jewish attorney steps up, presents his case, well, then it's time for Paul to present his side of the story. Look at verse 10, and this is where we'll pick up this morning. So again, get the scene. Felix, the governor, is presiding over the court. Tertullus, the Jewish attorney, had their time to say their side of the story. Now it's Paul's turn. Verse 10, when the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded. And he said, knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship, Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. And that's what they're trying to accuse Paul of. And by the way, that's what the Romans are trying to figure out, if Paul had caused a riot. Verse 13, nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. Verse 14 there, we covered this last week, but I feel like I need to mention this again. Go back to verse 5. Look at what Tertullus, the Jewish attorney, is saying, and notice what he says about Christians. He calls them, look at the end of the verse, a ringleader, he calls Paul the ringleader, of the sect of the Nazarenes. Okay? That right there tells you how the Jews felt about Christians. Okay? They did not consider Jesus Christ the Messiah. Therefore, they considered them still Jews. It's just you're a Jew, but you're part of this crazy division of Jews over here. And they called them the sect of the Nazarenes. And by the way, Jesus would preach against the division. You've got the sect of the Pharisees preached against, sect of the Sadducees. You had all this religious division. Well, now the Jews are saying, well, this is just another one of those sects. And notice that it doesn't say a sect of Christ, a sect of Jesus. It's a sect of the Nazarenes. And if you remember, the reputation that Nazareth had was it was just a poor little trashy town in the eyes of most Jews. And that's why you have Nathaniel saying, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so that's the Jews kind of sticking it to the Christians just a little bit there in a very subtle way, calling them a sect and calling them a sect of the Nazarenes. Well, Paul down here in verse 14 says, I admit to you that according to the way. And what would Jesus say? I'm the way. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He said, which they call a sect. I serve the God of our fathers. Because they did not recognize, they serve the same God, but they did not recognize the Son of God as the Messiah. Verse 15, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And that's actually where we stopped last week. We looked at how hope is directly tied to our salvation. Romans chapter 8, verse 26 says that for by hope we are saved. And then in Hebrews, it says that Jesus Christ will appear a second time, not according to sin, but for salvation to those who eagerly await Him. And so our hope is directly tied to salvation. Look at verse 16. He says, in view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience both before God and before men. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. By the way, does anybody remember the Bible class we had concerning Acts chapter 20 when Paul had taken a vow? Does anybody remember that Bible class? And how we were trying to explain why Paul would take this Old Testament vow and offer a sacrifice based on that vow. Remember that? And we were trying to explain why Paul would possibly do that, because that directly contradicts New Testament teaching. It directly contradicts things that Paul himself had written in the book of Galatians by that time. This is a possible explanation of that. Verse 17, he is referring specifically to when he came back to the temple and he had taken this, what was then a Nazirite vow, which was an Old Testament vow. And Paul himself would even say the Old Testament has been nailed to the cross, taken away, Colossians chapter 2. The enmity that exists against us, Galatians chapter 1. And so, but it says here in verse 17 that after several years I came back to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. Again, possible explanation of why he took that vow. Verse 18, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were certain Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusations if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them for the resurrection of the dead, I'm on trial before you today. All right, that is Paul's defense. Beginning there in verse 10, all the way down to verse 21 right there, that is Paul's defense of himself, of why he was in the middle of that uproar, that beatdown that was just outside the temple. Okay? I want to point one more thing out very quickly before we move on. He says here, certain Jews from Asia in verse 18. Now, I've made this point a couple of times already, but I'm going to make it again. Does anybody remember what Jews from Asia, and what region that is, and what other New Testament story out of the book of Acts we can trace back to Asia? Does anybody remember? When they stoned him. That's right. All right, second missionary journey. Think back to the second missionary journey. When Paul was making his way through, he was actually coming this way, up around Lystra and Iconium. That's the first missionary journey, I apologize. Because he came to Crete, which was an island, hit shore after Crete, and then came up and around, and then came down to Jerusalem like that. Well, as he came up over here to Lystra and Iconium, up through Asia, they stoned him, and they drug him out of the city, and they thought he was dead. That was in Lystra, okay? Well, you don't just think somebody's dead unless you're laying there beaten and bloodied and battered and motionless, lifeless. And they drug his lifeless body out of the city and left him. That was in Lystra. Well, Paul would get up and then from there travel 18 miles to the next town over called Iconium. And do you remember what they did? They followed him to Iconium. And they followed to Iconium, and there he experienced persecution as well. Well, then he gets back to the temple many years later, and lo and behold, who is it that gives him trouble in the temple? He initiates this riot that started, that got Paul arrested, but the Jews from Asia, exact same region from Lystra and Iconium. Okay? But I want you to notice something about these people and how much of a coward they are. He says, they ought to have been present before you and to make accusations. What does that tell you? Are they there or are they not there? They're not there. The ones who started all of this. They were the ones, if you remember the temple, and you go back to Acts chapter 21, when Paul was in the temple there, the Jews from Asia said, there he is, men and brethren, come to our aid. Let's get him. They were the ones who started this whole thing. And yet they're not here before Felix. Also notice what else it says. Verse 20, or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. Where was that trial? Where did that take place? That was in Jerusalem. That was where the temple was, where the same city where those Jews from Asia were. And what does that tell you? Did they show up to that trial or not? They didn't show up to that trial either. So these Jews from Asia, all the way back in Acts chapter 14, stoned Paul, drug him out of the city, found out that he got up and went to the next town, followed him to the next town, chased him out of the next town, and now those same Jews from that same region are down in the temple. Paul comes to the temple, they seize him, drag him out of the temple, try to beat him to death, and then they don't even show up to the Jewish council, and then this one before the governor of Judea himself. What absolute cowards. But that just goes to show the persecution that the Jews had against Christians. And that's something to remember. When the book of Acts closes, Roman persecution against Christians really hadn't even begun yet. Up to the book of Acts, it's really mainly the Jews that are persecuting Christians. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think that those people had almost no respect for any authority, not Roman authority, not even their Jewish council?
Sure.
As far as they didn't want anybody telling them to do or not to do.
Sure. Absolutely. Because I think even the Jewish council, what did the Jewish council tell, what did they decide to do with Jesus on the Tuesday that Jesus had been teaching in the temple? Did they decide to seize Jesus in the temple? Or what did they say? They said, well, we'll catch him outside the temple, lest a riot break out. And so even the Sanhedrin, which would be their authority, would say something to the effect of, we shouldn't be having riots inside the temple. And yet, what do these Jews from Asia do? They do exactly that. That's a very great point, Miss Sylvia. A blatant disregard for any type of authority at all. And that speaks to the nature of their religion. They have a very selfish religion. Their God that they have built up in their mind is not the true God that they are to be worshiping. It's a different God. Now, that is Paul's defense. And I want you to notice again, this is twice now that he mentions the resurrection. And I find that to be very, very interesting. Twice now he has said, I'm on trial for the resurrection. And again, that should just remind you that your faith is built around the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says that if Christ had not been raised from the dead, your faith is worthless. Meaning that everything you believe in, it's empty, it's vain, it's worthless. You believe in nothing if Christ is still in the grave. Paul says our preaching is in vain. He also says you're still in your sins if Christ is still in the grave. The resurrection is not just an afterthought of God. It's the pinnacle of the crucifixion. It's the pinnacle of the completion of the gospel. The resurrection is everything that we should be about as Christians. And by the way, that is what Sundays should be thought of. Sundays shouldn't be thought of as the day we just got to get up and beat the rain and come in here and go to church. Sundays isn't even the day that we just think I need to go worship God. Sundays is to be the day that we remember the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a resurrection day. Because it's the exact same day of the week that He rose from the dead. It's the day that we worship. Just much like the Sabbath was with God creating the world. Well, now we worship on a Sunday, the day that our Lord came up out of the grave. It's a resurrection day. Which is why our worship service pivots around the memorial service that we take. And that's why that's such a serious, serious thing. Which is what you see that with Paul here in his trials. Because notice what Paul doesn't say, by the way. This is a great Bible study tactic, is notice what he doesn't say. Okay? Does Paul start talking about how good of a person he is just to try to get off the hook? Does he try to manipulate in some way the council or talk about his pedigree? Does he ever talk about, I'm a Roman citizen and these simple Jews over here? What does Paul do every single time? He talks about the resurrection. He talks about Christ. He talks about his conversion, which is based upon the resurrection, is it not? And so that speaks volumes of the seriousness of the resurrection. He mentions it twice. All right, let's move on. We're going to be able to cover ground here. So Felix, the governor, in verse 22, it says, having a more exact knowledge about the way. Does anybody else's version have something other than more exact knowledge?
Accurate.
Do what?
Accurate.
Accurate, okay. Anything else? Do what? Perfect. Accurate, exact. Basically, Paul knew very well about Christianity. Now, question, was Paul a Christian, or was Felix a Christian? No, he was not a Christian, but he knew very well exactly what Christianity was. He knew about the movement, which it tells us if he had an exact or a perfect knowledge, or you said perfect or exact knowledge, that would tell us that he knew about Jesus Christ. He knew who Jesus was. He knew about his death, burial, and resurrection. And he knew about these Christians and who they follow. He knew about the way. But notice what he does with this knowledge. He says, but Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I'll decide your case. All right, pop quiz. Who's Lysias?
Got another the beacon was taken at.
That's right. He's the Roman commander, okay, the commander of the guard, of the Roman guard, who, when the Romans came down and got Paul out of that riot that was taking place in Temple, or that beatdown that was taking place just outside the Temple, he was the commander of the Roman guard that did that. So that's Lysias. So Felix says, no, I don't want to hear any more of what you're saying. We're just going to put a pause on this. He says, we're going to wait for Lysias to come down. Verse 23, he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. Okay? By the way, that right there speaks to the treatment, again, that Paul is receiving. We looked at that last week. Does anybody remember how many troops, how many soldiers accompanied Paul out of Jerusalem when those death threats came on? Do what? Do you remember how many? 470. 470. 200 foot soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 horse soldiers. Is that the correct one? I don't know if that's the soldiers on a horse. And Paul himself was placed on a horse. And they escorted him, 470 soldiers, and Paul got to sit on a horse out of Jerusalem to Caesarea. That's the treatment. And then he got to stay in Herod's palace. And by the way, I told y'all to go look that up last week. They discovered Herod's palace in Caesarea, where this exact trial just took place. You can find it on YouTube. Palace took up 162 acres. And that was Herod the Great who built that. Okay? And so, this again just shows their treatment of him. They allowed him to have some freedom, and they didn't prevent anybody from coming to him and ministering to him, giving him things, bringing him things. Verse 24, some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla. Okay? We're going to talk about her more here in just a second. His wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Pause for just a second. They sent for Paul to try to ask him more about his case. They sent for Paul to try to figure out why he was being beaten up outside the temple. Why did they send for Paul? What does it say? To hear more about Christ. To hear more about Jesus. Well, Felix already knows. See what I'm trying to build up here? Felix already knows. It says he has a more exact knowledge, a more perfect knowledge of the way. He knows who Christians are and who they follow and why they follow him. And now he's calling Paul. His wife comes and he's like, "Hey, let's bring Paul out here and listen to a sermon." So Paul comes out and he preaches faith in Christ Jesus. I want you to notice what he preaches, because Paul doesn't hold anything back, and I'm going to show you. Listen to this, verse 25. As he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." All right. You know why he preached those things? Why when Paul was called to preach faith in Christ Jesus, okay, you're dealing with somebody who already knows who Jesus is. So does he need to preach a sermon about the nature and characteristic of Jesus? He already knows who Jesus is. Okay. Does he need to know? Does he need to preach about how to become a Christian? Oh, he already knows about the way. He already knows about Christianity. What did he preach on? Righteousness, controlling yourself, and judgment. Why would he preach on those three things? It was well known throughout the whole country that Felix had stolen Drusilla from her first husband. It was well known. Drusilla, by the way, do you know who Drusilla is? She is the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. Okay? Do you see the kind of interconnection here? Drusilla is the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. That would make her the great-niece of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was the one who beheaded John the Baptist. That would make her the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who had James the Apostle beheaded. She was about 6 years old when that happened. Okay? And she is the sister of Herod Agrippa II, who Paul is about to stand trial before here in just a little bit. Okay? So, did Paul, knowing, because again, that was very famous. Even still to this day, you can find historical writings that speak of Felix stealing Drusilla away. Because Drusilla is this very prominent person. Okay? She wasn't just some slave girl or just some nobody who just so happened to be married to the governor. She is a sister to King Herod Agrippa II. And that speaks of the Roman hierarchy, by the way. You would have governors. Felix is the governor. But Herod Agrippa II is the king over a larger area. Not to be confused with the Emperor of Rome, by the way. Because the Emperor of Rome would be over all the kings of his empire, but the king of each little section of the empire would be over the governors of each little region, okay? Drusilla is the sister to the king. Felix is the governor of Judea. And the governor of Judea stole the sister to the king away from her first husband. And Paul had an opportunity to preach to her. And what does he preach? Righteousness, self-control, and judgment. And what does it say that Felix became? Frightened. Frightened. He was pierced to the heart, just like those Jews were in Acts chapter 2, verse 38. But what did they do? They did the right thing, right? What did he do? He did the wrong thing. He said, he plugged his ears and said, I don't want to hear it anymore. Go away. When I want to hear again, I'll call for you. It's the same thing still to this day. I've been studying on the parable of the sower this past week, and it just continues to remind me that the parable of the sower was never meant to be only about evangelism. You see, even right now, I'm throwing seeds out. Depends on what your heart is. It could have a bunch of weeds in it, or some rocks, or it could be good, fertile soil. And so even still, the word, the seed that is implanted can either be received, and it can grow, or it's going to be choked out. And in this case, Felix's heart was so hard when Paul threw seeds of righteousness, self-control, and judgment at him, it just bounced right off. And what does it say happened? That the crows come and eat the seed, doesn't it? That parable was never meant to be only about evangelism. But that's what takes place here. Felix's heart was just as hard as a rock, and he didn't want to hear anymore. Look at verse 26. It says, at the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. Does that imply that Paul did or did not give him money? Paul could care less if he was sitting in jail. He could accomplish just as much for the gospel, in or out of jail. Verse 27, but after 2 years had passed, this is important because this is where people get confused a lot. Felix and Festus. They sound familiar, don't they? Felix was succeeded, look at verse 27, by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. All right, how much time has gone by now?
2 years.
How long?
2 years.
2 years. 2 years Paul has been sitting in jail, okay? Now, we don't know exactly when Paul wrote Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Philemon. We don't know exactly when. If it was either here or when he actually went to Rome or he was in Roman custody. But this is when those letters were written, when Paul was arrested the first time. And so sometime around this time period where Paul is either in prison here or in Roman prison, he wrote most of those letters. I know some of those letters for sure he wrote while he was in Roman prison. Some of the other ones we don't know the exact date of. Felix was the governor first. Festus takes his place. When Festus took his place, Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, and so he left Paul in prison, which implies he had the power to do what? Set him free. But what did he not do? He didn't set him free. Now, Festus has a problem on his hands. Okay, the new governor. All right, so he's the new governor. He's the new guy. This is like his first. He's new on the job, right? He's got this problem, and it's a big problem. What do they still not know about Paul? Do what? They don't even know what he did. They don't know anything. That's exactly right. They don't know anything about why Paul was in the middle of this riot or not. They're still trying to figure out what's going on. That's going to set up what's about to take place. Okay? Verse 25 says, Festus, therefore, having arrived in the province, 3 days later went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priest and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. All right. Now, I don't think these men had not been without food and water this whole time. Y'all remember the 40 men who took a vow? They said, we're going to lay in wait. We're not going to eat or drink anything until we kill Paul. Pretend like you're going to call him, right? I think they probably ate and drank something. But what still is existing in their minds? Murder. They still want to kill Paul. There's nothing righteous about this. There's nothing in the Old Testament that justifies their behavior right here. It's just plain and simple murder. And now the Jewish council is in on it. The Jewish council is the one that's heading it up, deciding to tell. They pulled the governor himself aside and said, hey, by the way, that prisoner you got all the way back in Caesarea, why don't you bring him here to Jerusalem? So we can kind of figure out some charges and things. While in the back of their mind, they were setting an ambush to kill him. They were setting an ambush to kill him. Verse 4, Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. You kind of see the disdain a little bit between the Romans and the Jews. The Romans hated the Jews way before they ever hated the Christians, which plays into their hatred of Christianity a little bit, because they really hated anything outside of emperor worship to begin with, but especially the Jews. They hated them with a passion, and you can see that disdain. Is that the Jewish council came up to Festus while he was in Jerusalem and said, hey, bring Paul down here. We'll do the trial right here. We got big charges for him. We'll take care of it. And then Festus's answer was, no, if you got charges, you come to Caesarea. I'm leaving. I'm not coming back to Jerusalem. If you want to bring charges, you come to Caesarea. You kind of feel that disdain a little bit against him. Excuse me. Verse 6, after he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. And on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. And after he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense, either against the law or the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor. All right, so this is twice now that we see them wanting to do the Jews a favor. Is it because the Romans liked the Jews? Or did they like power and money? That's all it was about. They don't like the Jews. They don't like the Jewish council. They don't have any honor or respect for them at all. It's all about power and money. So Festus, who's the current governor, wanted to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I'm a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Okay? That is very important. Very, very important, because that is going to set up what's about to take place. Okay? By the way, I've mentioned this before in the past, because when you go back, you take Acts chapter 25 and verse 11 of where Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. You go back to verse 11 of chapter 23. Jesus appeared to him, stood beside him, and said, take courage, for as you solemnly witnessed my cause at Jerusalem, so you must also at Rome also. So Paul knew that he was going to go to Rome. He knew it. And so as he's standing there before Festus, Festus is asking him, are you willing to go to Jerusalem? Are you willing to go to Jerusalem to get this trial over with? Paul says, no, I'm not going to Jerusalem. If I've done anything worthy of death, I don't mind dying if I've done something worthy of death. He said, but I haven't done anything at all. He said, I stand before Caesar's tribunal, therefore I appeal to Caesar. Okay? Interesting note, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Roman citizens had the right to appeal before Caesar himself. All they had to do was request it. Now, whether they actually got to appear before Caesar was up to various trials and things that would go on to allow you the opportunity to appear before Caesar. But if you were a Roman citizen, they would at least entertain the idea that you had the right to appear before Caesar himself. And so Paul, when he says right here, I appeal to Caesar, notice what Festus tells him. He says, when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. So Festus gives him the green light. Festus could have stopped that, by the way. He could have said, no, your case is not worthy of going to Caesar. But he gives him the green light and says, okay, you want to go to Caesar? You're going to go stand before Caesar. So now, think of the seriousness of that. Paul's going to go stand before the emperor of Rome himself. In Rome. That's a serious, serious thing. And what a great opportunity, by the way. We're going to talk more about that great opportunity here after a little while, maybe a couple of chapters away. But now Festus has a problem on his hands, and a serious problem. He's about to send a prisoner to Rome, to Caesar himself, to his boss, right? He's about to send a prisoner to his boss, and he has no idea why he's sending him. He has no idea the charges that Paul has. Again, put that in perspective. They still don't know why Paul's in jail. They don't know. All they know is there was a riot and Paul was in the middle of it. That's all they're still trying to figure it out. And so now Festus, because of Paul saying, hey, I appeal to Caesar. Festus says, all right, to Caesar you shall go. Now he's got a problem. He's got to send a prisoner to Rome, to his boss, to the emperor himself. And he's got to figure out what to charge him with. And depending on what he charges him with, it's either going to make Festus look good or look bad, right? So he's kind of thinking about it himself and his own political skin. Well, now he's given an opportunity. An opportunity has just been kind of laid in his lap. Look at the next verse. When several days had elapsed, King Agrippa, there he is. King Herod Agrippa, okay? He's part of the Herodian family, the Herodian dynasty. King Herod Agrippa and Bernice, his wife, arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. Okay, so King Agrippa is just traveling through the countryside, and he comes to Caesarea, and he finds Festus, the governor there, and pays homage to him, right? Which is basically customary. And so when Agrippa had come there, it says in verse 14, while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. Remember, that's the previous governor, right? And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation upon him, asking for death. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accuser face to face, and he has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. And so after they had assembled, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not to such crimes as I was expecting. But they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain dead man, Jesus. Notice the disdain against him, whom Paul asserted him to be alive. Romans didn't care. The Romans saw this as a religious squabble between the Jews and the Christians. That's how they saw this. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand on trial in these matters. Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, Caesar's decision. I ordered him to be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. All right, and this is where we're going to end here this morning, but I just wanted to set this up for next week, okay? Festus has a problem on his hands. A high-profile prisoner has appealed to Caesar, the emperor of Rome himself. And now Festus is going to have to send him to Caesar, and he doesn't know why. He has no idea why or what charges. And so now Festus has the king, Agrippa himself, come into town. And so Festus is like, here's my opportunity. I'll let King Agrippa decide what Paul should be charged with. Then I'll send him to Rome with those charges. And then next week, Lord willing, we'll get into Paul standing before Herod Agrippa and that council there and the whole scene and everything. Lord willing, next week. So we got to stop right there. We're out of time. Thank you all so much for listening.